Good afternoon, everyone. I am Amber Hanover. I am the Community Engagement Lead here at Mass. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am coming to you today from Regina, which is located on Treaty 4 territory. Mass's work and support reaches lands covered by Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, currently known as the Province of Saskatchewan. It's comprised of the territories of the Naheilak, Anishinabeg, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Métis, and Nakota nations. This land acknowledgement is an act of reconciliation and expression of our gratitude to those whose territory we reside on and are visiting. We are committed to focusing on repairing the relationships between immigrant Canadians who have settled here for over centuries and the First Nations people who have walked these lands since time immemorial. Mass recognizes the roles of museums in perpetuating colonial practices in Canada, both directly and indirectly through collection and display practices, policy, and harmful rhetoric. We commit to explore our roles in nurturing meaningful relationships and building understanding. We dedicate our efforts to working together in the spirit of collaboration and reconciliation. We are all treaty people. Welcome to today's community chat. It's the Museums Association of Saskatchewan's online personal development opportunity, a chance to network with other museums and professionals, to chat, ask questions, and seek advice. On Saturday, June 9th, 2023, Mass held its annual AGM and Member Forum at Wanuskewin. The Mass board led the discussion and asked those in attendance, what is your biggest question about repatriating objects? Sarah Durham, the museum's advisor for Mass, is joining us to respond to these questions and discuss the steps to be taken to assist in the repatriation process. Sarah will be doing a presentation with a chance for questions and discussion to follow. Sarah, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Amber. And yes, just as a quick introduction, for those of you who don't know me, I am Sarah Durham. I'm the museum's advisor with the Museums Association of Saskatchewan. For the presentation, I'm going to have my camera off just so I don't have competing issues with bandwidth. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to start my screen share. Right, so hopefully you can all see this. Can everybody see this? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Because I can no longer see any of you. All right. So, oh yeah, sorry. I also I have the privilege of joining you today also from Regina in Treaty 4 territory. So without further ado, welcome to our community chat on repatriation, where and how to start, and what you need to know in advance to help your repatriation work be successful. Whoops. There we go. So common concerns that were brought up from the AGM Member Forum were, there's a lot of variations. We had about 37 responses, and the variations were of how do you start, what needs to go back, who do you give it back to, who do you speak to, how to convince people that repatriation is the right thing to do, and what funds are available and how to budget for this. So the intention of this presentation is to hopefully answer these questions and give you the foundations necessary to assist you in your own institution's repatriation efforts. So as a bit of background, this image was pulled from a CBC article back in June titled "Millions of Indigenous Artifacts are still on display in museums around Canada." And they are not wrong. From the 2019 Government of Canada survey of heritage institutions, approximately 1/3 of museums have Indigenous cultural belongings or ancestral remains in their collections. That's an estimated, or sorry, that was estimated at over 6.5 million objects and about 2,000 full or partial remains, and that is just within Canada. Last August, Mass released a survey to our institutional members asking them to identify if they had Indigenous material in their museum's permanent collection. We have about 230 odd institutional members at this time. And so far we've received about 30%, or sorry, we've received responses from about 30% of our membership. And of the respondents, about 20% have identified that they do not have Indigenous material in their collections. About 12% were unsure, and the remaining 68% identified that they do have Indigenous material within their collection. So that begs the question of, where do you start with repatriation? First and foremost, you need to know what you have in your collection. If you do not currently know, you need to take the time to conduct a complete inventory of your collection to identify what you know or suspect to be of Indigenous origin. You should also include any archival material. This will be photographs, audio, video recordings, or even journal entries that depict, discuss, or otherwise represent Indigenous people and cultures. In other words, it has to be a full assessment of your collection. You need to know what documentation exists for each object within your institution. Have the items been researched? Is the provenance clear? Do you know when it was collected? Do you know how it was collected? And be prepared to spend time researching to answer any of these questions that are not currently answered within your paperwork. You will need to consult widely as you are researching, by which I mean you'll need to refer to not only just internal records that you've generated for your acquisition process or internal research, or consulting your own archives, but you also need to consult external records. So you'll have to go to external libraries and archives, museums outside of your own institution. You should consult with staff, both past and present, and volunteers, both past and present. You will have to likely consult with donors or donors' families to try and build as comprehensive a picture of the object's history as you possibly can. It is also incredibly important that during this research phase, the museums document thoroughly what you are doing for research, what sources you are consulting, who you are consulting, and keep that as part of the record. This information will need to be shared with Indigenous rights holders in the event of repatriation or with access, or I guess a use, or however it will be defined within your cooperation with rights holders. As to what you give back, any cultural belonging held by museums may be subject to repatriation claims. It is not up to the museum to determine what is eligible for repatriation. That significance can only be determined by the originating community, the Indigenous rights holders. With Canada's acceptance of UNDRIP in 2021, going forward, museums with Indigenous collections must recognize that ultimately the decision for rights to maintain, control, protect, and develop cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions of Indigenous peoples belongs to Indigenous peoples. This will also include the rights to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. I am paraphrasing the UNDRIP Article 31.1, which outlines this. Museums are expected to adhere to these articles while undertaking this work, which means the decision about best care and place for these objects is not up to the museum to make. It lies with the Indigenous rights holders. You will also need to I guess, ask yourself if your museum does currently have a repatriation policy. You'll need to think critically about how this policy is accessible, because if it's only sent out in response to repatriation claims, people will not know what you're offering for alternate avenues of, I guess, use, care, and access for originating communities. Your repatriation policy is a guideline for your institution on how you will process claims, but it also needs to be responsive to the needs of the communities that you are serving, being the originating communities, the Indigenous rights holders, and it needs to be flexible to adjust to what their individual laws and protocols are that they have in place. So your repatriation policy will need to be available publicly. This can either be posting it online on your webpage, this can be circulating it deliberately to communities nearest you and communities you know whose cultural belongings you have in your collection. So just as a guiding post for so they know what to expect when they start a repatriation claim, or if they wish to go into negotiations into discussion with you on how to care for what you hold in your collection. Because it's ultimately, repatriation can start in one of two ways. Most commonly, it's Indigenous-led initiatives where the Indigenous rights holders reach out to museums about what they have or ask for the specific return of items that they've identified. The second is a museum-led, so where the museum notifies the Indigenous rights or the originating community, the Indigenous rights holders, of what they hold in their collection. This will include, and should really include, both what is identified as originating from that community and items that have not been identified for their place of origin. Indigenous rights holders can be the originating communities, the families, or individuals. This will be defined by those communities. So you'll need to consult with the Indigenous communities to understand the laws and protocols that are used within those communities. Where the museum does not know who the Indigenous right holders are, they have to start researching and reach out to the communities nearest them, or the point of collection, again, if it's known, to identify possible rights holders. The less known, the broader the discussion will have to be to involve as many potential rights holders. You will need to consult widely for items where the originating community is unknown. Connecting with communities can mean connecting with elder advisory circles for the community, working with chief and council, or working with recognized knowledge keepers in the communities. Ask the cultural groups or the originating communities, the Indigenous rights holders that you are working with, whose cultural belongings you have in your collection, what their ceremonial processes for repatriation are. Protocols are not necessarily universal. They can vary between nations and they can vary between communities. Your museum will need to be able to host or accommodate visits with Indigenous rights holders to view the objects, whether as part of the preliminary research or as part of the broader discussion on repatriation and care and use and access. You may have to close a museum to the public to accommodate visits or arrange for visits outside of your regular operating hours, maybe even in your off season. You'll have to make space for any ceremonial necessities or offerings that may take place as part of ongoing care of objects. And with objects of unknown cultural affiliations, be prepared to engage in conversations with potential Indigenous rights holders, which can mean hosting them at your institution to view and consult. It also may mean taking objects to communities to try and help identify whether or not they originated with those communities. So convincing people that repatriation, oh wait, I'm sorry. I seem to have gone backwards. There we go. So convincing people that repatriation should be done, because repatriation is ultimately a good thing. Shana Willison, in an article from 2022 from the McGill International Review, said there can be no reconciliation if museums do not cooperate and approve requests for the return of these artifacts with dignity and respect. Repatriation is something that must happen for museums to be able to go forward to build connections with Indigenous rights holders. To convince your community that repatriation is a good thing, you need to be open and transparent about what you are doing and why. This may mean hosting meetings or open public forums, whatever it will look like for you to effectively communicate to the public that you serve what and why you're doing. Because repatriation is a foregone conclusion at this point. It is an obligation of museums to repatriate. And it's like, and do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Fear of making a mistake should not hinder repatriation work. If you have questions, ask. If you have concerns, voice them. It is only through clear and open dialogue that you can gain an understanding of the work and what must be done, and to be open and involve all parties when you're uncertain of decisions that need to be made. Repatriation efforts led by museums are a perfect opportunity for building partnerships, for strengthening those understandings and opportunities for further meaningful engagement between museums and the originating communities going forward. Because it's ultimately, repatriation is a discussion because it is not in the best care or interest of the object or the originating communities to continue to have items removed from those communities. How an object is cared for will be determined by the Indigenous rights holders. And it should be, and the museum should not really be interested in how the object is cared for once it leaves the museum's collection, because the understanding should be it will be cared for in an appropriate cultural fashion by the community that created it. It's also, we do know that traditional conservation and museum practices are often at odds with the spiritual care of objects. And I don't want people to engage in repatriation work only to start imposing conditions upon the repatriation. That's not an acceptable thing to do. It is all right to approach groups and to share with them your policy and the alternatives that exist, and to enter in discussions about alternatives that they are interested in pursuing. But ultimately, if repatriation has been requested, repatriation should be the avenue the museum pursues. Unfortunately, at this time, there is very little funding to support repatriation efforts and initiatives within museums. I mean, having said that, there are elements of repatriation projects that may be eligible under existing grants, like the museum's assistance program's Indigenous Heritage Grant or the museum's grant program from SaskCulture. It is definitely worth speaking to grantors to understand what the eligibility criteria is for these grants. And I will let you, I also feel it's important to let you know that there will be a webinar from the Alberta Museums Association on September 14th on, I think it's titled Federal Support for Indigenous Heritage Projects. And it's with the Museums Assistance Program and Canadian Border Services Agency. I think the registration for that will open on August 30th. Repatriation is something that, going forward, for institutions that have Indigenous collections, repatriation is something you're going to have to build into your annual operating budget, if it isn't already. The cost to be aware of, because it's difficult to gauge how much repatriation will cost, because a lot of this will always be on a case-by-case basis. What works at one instance may not work at another. What you anticipate or incurred for costs at another may not translate to a different repatriation or gathering that you are hosting for repatriation. But costs to be aware of and to think of will be things like covering site visits. So that can include mileage, hotel stays, meals, the literal transportation of the object, honorarium for elders. And it's, again, at this point, I would like to remind you that the ceremonies and protocols for repatriation may vary between nations and communities. I feel this is an incredibly short presentation. I actually don't know how long I've been speaking for. Just realized my watch is dead and I can't see the clock. So I do have resources that I've consulted while I was compiling information for this presentation that is in a PDF that will be shared in the chat. We can also share those resources if you wish to email us. But the 3 resources I've listed on this page or this slide are the ones that if you don't read anything else, read these. I'm also assuming that you have already read the UNDRIP articles and the move to action report from the CMA, because ultimately those are the kind of foundational documents to work with and to work off of. But definitely more than giving back is the reconciliation toolkit from the Canadian Museums Association. And if you don't yet have a policy in place for repatriation, pages 11 through 15 do break down how to approach decolonizing your repatriation policy. It covers wonderfully elements that you need to take into serious consideration for when you're compiling your policy and how to approach policy. It's also, because it's part of the repatriation toolkit, it does go over extensively considerations about repatriation at every stage. That would include your preliminary assessment of your collections, the information you need to consult, how you need to compile information. The Small Museums Handbook helps put into practice what was covered and what was expected out of the Move to Action report. And the Indigenous Repatriation Handbook is fantastic as a consultation read for museums, because it is written from the perspective of Indigenous communities who are going out to do repatriation work. So when you read this, you will know what information you need to have, because it's the information that they are looking for, and how you need to make it accessible. Because making information on how to contact you, on what you have, and like, I guess, how to submit and start a repatriation claim is really significant to making this work. Oh yeah, also, sorry, before I forget, at any point in time, you can reach out to Mass directly. You can contact me if you have any questions or comments or concerns. If you don't know how to start something, or if you have a question that comes up that you don't want to voice in the Q&A, that I will start now because I'm going to stop my screen share. But yeah, my contact is at the bottom.
Thank you, Sarah. Again, some of the resources that Sarah mentioned, I put in the chat. So there is the PDF document that she has compiled. So that's available for review and download right in the chat. But again, you can contact us if you need a copy of that. The webinar that she mentioned on September 14th, the link is there, as well as the beginning of the chat. I did include a form, and that is our the masses, sorry, what's the title of it?
Oh yeah, the Indigenous Materials in Saskatchewan Museum Survey.
Yeah. So if you haven't filled that out, like Sarah said, I believe about 30% have completed. So please take a look at that. And again, contact us with any questions. So if you do have any questions at this time, you're welcome to put them in the chat. You can raise your hand and turn your camera or just your sound on. And Sarah will do her best to answer any you might have.
I can't decide the silence is reassuring or disconcerting.
No, I think you covered a lot and covered it greatly. Like I said, the resources that Sarah have compiled are all very important in this process as we move forward. And again, I think just the idea that Sarah, I'm just going to reiterate what you said. The idea of when or what, and if things are unclear in any stage, is to just ask. And that's what we're here for. We are more than happy to guide you in the right direction and are working on developing resources, as well as, again, sharing all of these resources that are widely out there. Okay, well, at this time then, I will just... Okay, there's a question here, sorry.
Yeah, it's sorry, I'm reading that. Yeah, so repatriating things to the United States, that will likely pose some challenges. I'm not overly familiar with what, I guess, laws would be in place there. I know they have NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. I'm without any real evidence to support this, I would strongly recommend that you attend the Alberta Museums Association's presentation on September 14th, because they will have the Canadian Border Services Agency in attendance, which I think would be able to answer any questions you have about, I guess, transporting heritage across borders, because it's, regretfully, I am not a lawyer, which is probably a good thing. So it's, what I'm giving you is best practices based off of museums, and regretfully, I don't know what challenges that will pose. I would still urge you to reach out to the originating communities if you know where they originated from in the United States. That way they might have been doing repatriation work, and they might have a little more information for you on that. Sorry, it's not a great answer.
No, that's useful though. And I believe that they'd be, you know, a better person to ask in that if they've ever experienced that. Otherwise, again, you can look through the list of resources that were supplied. And I know that they might not directly address that question.
Yeah, I think on that list, the Arts Council of England might have some, I imagine England gets a lot of repatriation claims from external entities from beyond just England. So they might have a little more a guidance. Again, it'll be from the perspective of museums in the UK versus in Canada, but potentially they might have something written in there that could be applicable to your situation, because they might let you know that, oh, repatriating to the United States, US law takes precedent over America or over English or whichever. Oh, yeah, that's a great one. Which unfortunately I did not include in that list, but I will going forward.
Thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie from the Canadian Museums Association is here with us today, and she just shared a link in the chat from Indian Affairs International Repatriation Guide. So that's awesome. And Emma Morris, our executive director, is just another reminder for any specific situations or questions that you might have. Please don't hesitate to contact us, and we can help you through the process and put you in touch with the right groups as well. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you again, Sarah, for joining us today and putting that together. For any specific details that Sarah might have shared, and some more resources that Mass is developing, please check out our website and online. And if you haven't already, please sign up for our ephemera. It's our newsletter that comes out bi-weekly, and we do have some educational tools that we include in that as well. Just as a reminder too, you can view the full lineup of our upcoming presentations through our community chats or any other workshops on our website as they are scheduled. And all of our previously recorded chats, including this one, will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, which you can see here. I'm just gonna put this YouTube channel in the chat here, just so you have it directly. Otherwise, you can view them directly on our website as well. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we will see you on the next one in September. Thanks.